Book 7, the Book of Yoga, Canto 2, The Parable of the Search for the Soul, page 474. As in the vigilance of the sleepless night, through the slow, heavy-footed silent hours, repressing in her bosom its load of grief, she sat staring at the dumb tread of time and the approach of ever-nearing fate. A summons from her being's summit came, a sound, a call that broke the seals of night above her brows, where will and knowledge meet. A mighty voice invaded mortal space. It seemed to come from inaccessible heights, and yet was intimate with all the world, and knew the meaning of the steps of time, and saw eternal destinies, changeless seen, filling the far prospect of the cosmic gaze. So Savitri is sitting with this load of grief of the foreknowledge of Satyavan's death, and here is a description where she hears a mighty voice above her brows where will and knowledge meet. A mighty voice invaded mortal space. It seemed to come from inaccessible heights, and yet was intimate with all the world, and knew the meaning of the steps of time, and saw eternal destinies, changeless seen, filling the far prospect of the cosmic gaze. As the voice touched, her body became a stark and rigid golden statue of motionless trance. So as the voice touched, her body became a stark and rigid golden statue of motionless trance, a stone of God lit by an amethyst soul. Around her body's stillness, all grew still. Her heart listened to its slow, measured beats. Her mind, renouncing thought, heard and was mute. In quotations. Why camest thou to this dumb, death-bound earth, this ignorant life, beneath indifferent skies, tied like a sacrifice on the altar of time? O Spirit, O immortal energy, if it was to nurse grief in a helpless heart, or with hard, tearless eyes await thy doom. So Savitri hears this voice, and she is sitting quietly like a statue, and this voice is asking her, why have you come here on this death-bound earth? O Spirit, O immortal energy, if it was only to nurse grief in a helpless heart, or with hard, tearless eyes await your doom, have you come here to be just a witness of what is going to happen to you? Or are you going to do something about it? The voice continues, arise, O soul, and vanquish time and death. So Savitri hears this voice above, telling her very clearly, arise, O soul, and vanquish time and death. So as you know what Mother has said about death, she said that death is a bad habit. It is not inevitable. But Savitri's heart replied in the dim night, my strength is taken from me and given to death. Why should I lift my hands to the shut heavens, or struggle with mute, inevitable fate, or hope in vain to uplift an ignorant race who hug their lot and mock the Saviour light, and see in mine wisdom's sole tabernacle, in its harsh peak and its inconscient base, a rock of safety and an anchor of sleep? Savitri replies to that voice and says, my strength is taken from me and given to death. So why should I lift my hands and struggle with mute, inevitable fate? and hope in vain to lift an ignorant race, who hug their lot and mock the Saviour light, and see in mind wisdom's sole tabernacle, in its harsh peak and its inconscient base, a rock of safety and an anchor of sleep? Is there a God whom any cry can move? He sits in peace and leaves the mortal strength, impotent against his calm, omnipotent law, and in conscience and the almighty hands of death. What need have I? What need has Satyavan to avoid the black meshed net, the dismal door, or call a mightier light into life's closed room, a greater law into man's little world? Why should I strive with earth's unyielding laws, or stave off death's inevitable hour? Why should I strive with earth's unyielding laws, or stave off death's inevitable hour? This surely is best, to practice with my fate and follow close behind my lover's steps, and pass through night from twilight to the sun, across the tenebrous river that divides the adjoining parishes of earth and heaven. So why should I fight with death? Why should I strive against earth's unyielding laws? Instead, let me follow through the night from twilight to the sun, across the tenebrous river that divides the adjoining parishes of earth and heaven. Let me follow Satyavan when he dies. Then could we lie inarmed breast upon breast, untroubled by thought, untroubled by our hearts, forgetting man and life and time and its hours, forgetting eternity's call, forgetting God. The voice replied, Is this enough, O Spirit? And what shall thy soul say when it wakes and knows the work was left undone for which it came? Or is this all for thy being born on earth, charged with a mandate from eternity, a listener to the voices of the years, a follower of the footprints of the gods, to pass and leave unchanged the old dusty laws? Shall there be no new tables, no new word, no greater light come down upon the earth, delivering her from her unconsciousness, man's spirit from unalterable fate? Camest thou not down to open the doors of fate, the iron doors that seemed forever closed, and lead man to truth's wide and golden road that runs through finite things to eternity? Is this then the report that I must make, my head bowed with shame before the eternal seat? His power he kindled in thy body has failed, his laborer returns, her task undone. Then Savitri's heart fell mute, it spoke no word, but holding back her troubled rebel heart, abrupt, erect and strong, calm like a hill, surmounting the seas of mortal ignorance, its peak immutable above mind's air, a power within her answered the still voice, I am thy portion here, charged with thy work, as thou myself seated forever above. Speak to my depths, O great and deathless voice. Command, for I am here to do thy will. The voice replied, Remember why thou camest. Find out thy soul, recover thy hid self. In silence seek God's meaning in thy depths. Then mortal nature change to the divine. Open God's door, enter into his trance. Cast thought from thee, that nimble ape of light, in his tremendous hush, stilling thy brain. His vast truth wake within, and know and see. Cast from thee sense that veils thy spirit's sight. In the enormous emptiness of thy mind, thou shalt see the Eternal's body in the world. Know him in every voice heard by thy soul. In the world's contacts, meet his single touch. All things shall fold thee into his embrace. Conquer thy heart's throbs. Let thy heart beat in God. Thy nature shall be the engine of his works. Thy voice shall house the mightiness of his word. Then shalt thou harbour my force and conquer death. Then Savitri by her doomed husband sat, still rigid in her golden motionless pose, a statue of the fire of the inner sun. In the black night, the wrath of storm swept by. The thunder crashed above her, the rain hissed, its million footsteps pattered on the roof. Impassive mid the movement and the cry, witness of the thoughts of mind, the moods of life, she looked into herself and sought for her soul. So this canto, the parable of the search for the soul, here it is the exact point where, you remember last time what we read, she heard this voice, Savitri, remember why thou camest, find out thy soul, recover thy hid self, in silence seek God's meaning in thy depths, then mortal nature change to the divine. You remember last time that Savitri wanted to go. She said, if Satyavan is going to die, I am also going to give up my body and go with him. And she was in deep anguish and aspiration when she heard this voice that spoke to her and told her that, is that why you came here? Why have you come down on earth? What is the purpose of your life? What is it that you have come here to do? Is it to live like other people and die? Is that what missioned you down? So Savitri then begins to, after hearing this voice, she also hears the voice telling her later that conquer thy heart's throbs, let thy heart beat in God. Thy nature shall be the engine of his works. Thy voice shall house the mightiness of his word. Then shalt thou harbour my force and conquer death. So when this voice gives her this promise, this kind of intimation that she has to rise above her ordinary mortal nature. She has to rise above her egoistic love for Satyavan. She has to rise above her egoism, in fact, because it is the ego that feels and lives in smallness, lives in bounds, sees things from a very narrow perspective. And she has to then become something almost divine, immortal in her consciousness, to be able to do what she has come here to do. So when she hears this voice, that only then you will conquer death, when you are able to house the mightiness of my word and get rid of your small self that is so attached to the life, to all the small pleasures of life. And then she begins to look into her soul and searches for her true being. And that is how this passage ends. Then Savitri by her doomed husband sat. So she still is sitting right next to Satyavan. And all these thoughts and all of this is going through her. And then when she hears this voice telling her this, she goes within and she looks for her soul. So now we come to the next passage. A dream disclosed to her the cosmic past, the crypt seed and the mystic origins, the shadowy beginnings of world fate. So when she goes deep into a kind of trance-like meditative state looking for her soul, she goes into almost like a dream vision state. That's why this passage starts with these words. A dream disclosed to her the cosmic past, the crypt seed and the mystic origins, the shadowy beginnings of world fate, a lamp of symbol lighting hidden truth, image to her the world's significance. In the indeterminate formlessness of self, creation took its first mysterious steps. It made the body's shape a house of soul, and matter learned to think, and person grew. She saw space peopled with the seeds of life, and saw the human creature born in time. At first appeared a dim, half-neutral tide of being emerging out of infinite naught. A consciousness looked at the inconscient vast, and pleasure and pain stirred in the insensible void. So this is a beautiful description. Savitri obviously has entered into the deep trance of her soul, and there in front of her she sees the entire beginning of creation, how creation actually rose, how through matter grew life, through life grew mind, through mind grew this person, and so on. This whole she almost goes back into the beginning of time and before that, when creation first began. Obviously, she's being given a deep education on the purpose of creation. What is the purpose of this earthly life? How earth began? What is the purpose of evolution? So here you read this and listen and quietly imagine, just see each thing. And when you see them, visualize it while I'm speaking. Then you will understand where it is going. At first appeared a dim half-neutral tide of being emerging out of infinite naught. A consciousness looked at the inconscient vast, and pleasure and pain stirred in the insensible void. All was the deed of a blind world energy, unconscious of her own exploits she worked, shaping a universe out of the inane. In fragmentary beings she grew aware, a chaos of little sensibilities gathered round a small ego's pinpoint head. In it a sentient creature found its poise. It moved and lived, a breathing, thinking whole, on a dim ocean of subconscious life, a formless surface. Consciousness awoke, a stream of thoughts and feelings came and went, a foam of memories hardened and became a bright crust of habitual sense and thought, a seat of living personality, and recurrent habits mimicked permanence, mind, nascent, labored out, a mutable form. It built a mobile house on shifting sands, a floating isle upon a bottomless sea. A conscious being was by this labor made. It looked around it on its difficult field, in the green, wonderful, and perilous earth. It hoped in a brief body to survive, relying on matter's false eternity. It felt a Godhead in its fragile house. It saw blue heaven, dreamed immortality. A conscious soul in the inconscious world, hidden behind our thoughts and hopes and dreams. An indifferent master, signing nature's acts, leaves the vicegerent mind, a seeming king. In his floating house upon the sea of time, the regent sits at work and never rests. He is a puppet of the dance of time. He is driven by the hours, the moment's call, compels him with the thronging of life's need and the babble of the voices of the world. This mind no silence knows, nor dreamless sleep. In the incessant circling of its steps, thoughts tread forever through the listening brain. It toils like a machine and cannot stop. Into the body's many storied rooms, into the body's many storied rooms, endless crowd down the dream god's messages. So into the body's many storied rooms, endless crowd down the dream god's messages. All is 100 tombed, murmur and babble and stir. There is a tireless running to and fro, a haste of movement and a ceaseless cry. The hurried servant senses answer apace to every knock upon the outer doors. Bring in time's visitors, report each call. Admit the 1,000 queries and the calls and the messages of communicating minds and the heavy business of unnumbered lives and all the 1,000-fold commerce of the world. So the senses and the outer mind is constantly busy like a servant. Keeps anything that happens, it reports it to the inner mind. So there is no rest. What Savitri is seeing is the functioning of the human machine, the human mechanism. How life came from the inconscient and from life came mind. And the way that the mind is working all the time on overdrive. Every little sense, every little thing it sees, every little thought that it comes in, it reports it constantly banging on the door, going down, up, down, restless. So you can see what a beautiful description this is of the way our own mind works. So this mind no silence knows, nor dreamless sleep. In the incessant circling of its steps, thoughts tread forever through the listening brain. It toils like a machine and cannot stop, and so on. So then it says it's like a hurried servant going to answer every knock upon the outer doors and brings in time's visitors, reports each call, admits the 1,000 queries and the calls and the messages of communicating minds and the heavy business of unnumbered lives and all the 1,000-fold commerce of the world. Even in the tracks of sleep is scant repose. Even in sleep, this mind doesn't stop. This is the working of the physical mind that just absolutely does not stop. Even in the tracks of sleep is scant repose. He mocks life's steps in strange subconscious dreams. He strays in a subtle realm of symbol scenes. His night with thin air visions and dim forms. He packs or peoples with slight drifting shapes, and only a moment spends in silent self. So wonderful description of the way we sleep. Our mind is so active in sleep that it does not allow a real repose or rest, except for a few moments in that Satchidanand where you get a true respite. So therefore, there is a whole science of sleep, how to sleep. And of course, the mother has spoken and explained that if you want to sleep in the right way, you don't need so much sleep, but you can go straight into that space of that dreamless sleep of deep repose. And even half an hour in that state can refresh you. So, but a lot of us are not able to go there at all. And some of us go there for hardly a few moments. So it depends how you wake up. So the days you wake up feeling tired, your head is heavy, and your body feels like you have to drag it out, and you feel that your energies are not bright and crisp and alive, those are the days you have not been there. That day continued into your mind, the same outer blah blah going on. So these are great psychological, the wisdom here, the kind of truths that one learns. You can really recreate your life if you know how to do it. So he is, of course, mind. He packs or peoples with slight drifting shapes, and only a moment spends in silent self. Adventuring into infinite mind space, he unfolds his wings of thought in inner air, or traveling in imagination's car, crosses the globe, journeys beneath the stars, to subtle worlds, takes his ethereal course, visits the gods on life's miraculous peaks, communicates with heaven, tampers with hell. This is the little surface of man's life. This whole description is the surface of man's life, of our life. This is the little surface of man's life. He is this and he is all the universe. So he is both this and he is also the whole universe. So not only is he this outer self that constantly is bombarded, but he is also the entire universe. He is this and he is all the universe. He scales the unseen. His depths dare the abyss. So he scales both the unseen and his depths dare the abyss. A whole mysterious world is locked within. Unknown to himself, he lives a hidden king. Unknown to himself, he lives a hidden king behind rich tapestries in great secret rooms, an epicure of the spirit's unseen joys. He lives on the sweet honey of solitude, a nameless God in an unapproachable fane, in the secret adytum of his inmost soul. He guards the being's covered mysteries beneath the threshold, behind shadowy gates, or shut in vast cellars of inconscient sleep. The immaculate, divine, all wonderful, casts into the argent purity of his soul his splendor and his greatness and the light of self-creation in time's infinity as into a sublimely mirroring glass. Man in the world's life works out the dreams of God, but all is there, even God's opposites. But all is there, even God's opposites. He is a little front of nature's works. He, meaning the human being, us, we. He is a little front of nature's works, a thinking outline of a cryptic force. All she reveals in him that is in her. Her glories walk in him, and her darknesses. Man's house of life holds not the gods alone. There are occult shadows, there are tenebrous powers, inhabitants of life's omnious nether rooms, a shadowy world's stupendous denizens, a careless guardian of his nature's powers. Man harbors dangerous forces in his house. So, when Savitri is gone into the cosmic past and she goes into herself to find her soul, a conscious soul in the unconscious world, she also discovers, and this is kind of and the narrator speaking, of the different parts of the human being, and also the fact that we don't only house the light but also the shadows, and we need to become aware of both the light and shadow in ourselves. So, a careless guardian of his nature's powers, man harbors dangerous forces in his house. The titan and the fury and the din lie bound in the subconscious cavern pit, and the beast grovels in his onter den. So, man, or all of us, have also the titan and the beast groveling in us. So both the darkest part of nature and the best part of nature both reside in the human being. Dire mutterings rise and murmur in their drowse. Insurgent sometimes raises its huge head, a monstrous mystery lurking in life's deeps, the mystery of dark and fallen worlds, the dread visages of the adversary kings, the dreadful powers held down within his depths, become his masters or his ministers. So these dreadful powers that are held down, almost submerged in his subconscious, the dreadful powers held down within his depths become his masters or his ministers. So these either completely take control of him or they become his ministers. They serve his ends. Enormous, they invade his bodily house, can act in his acts, infest his thought and life. Inferno surges into the human air and touches all with a perverting breath. Grey forces like a thin miasma creep, stealing through chinks in his closed mansion's doors, discoloring the walls of upper mind in which he lives his fair and specious life. and leave behind a stench of sin and death. Not only rise in him perverse drifts of thought and formidable formless influences, but there come presences and awful shapes. So, here is a description of the other side of the human nature, the titan and the jinn and the beast, and is clearly, beautifully described here, discoloring the walls of upper mind in which he lives his fair and specious life, and leaves behind a stench of sin and death. Not only rise in him perverse drifts of thought, so not only does it bring forward in us when we are under that attack or under that influence of the adverse force, perverse thoughts, meaning thoughts that are anti the light. Not only rise in him perverse drifts of thought and formidable formless influences, but there come presences and awful shapes, tremendous forms and faces, mount dim steps, and stare at times into his living rooms, or called up for a moment's passionate work, lay a dire custom's claim upon his heart. So all of us have these, and one has to become more and more self-observant and self-reflective to see when these parts in us rise up. It's not something that happens outside us, it happens within us. So to see when these begin to influence your own mind, your own thoughts, your own actions is very important. The reason why we are reading Savitri and Sri Aurobindo is explaining this is so that man becomes more conscious. We become more conscious of our own selves. So, but there come presences and awful shapes, tremendous forms and faces, mount dim steps and stare at times into his living rooms, or called up for a moment's passionate work, lay a dire custom's claim upon his heart. Aroused from sleep, they can be bound no more. Once these adverse forces, adverse influences, dark thoughts, dark and perverse ideas enter into the mind or into the heart, once they wake up, they can be bound no more. They start acting, afflicting the daylight. And how do they act? Afflicting the daylight and alarming night. So they start getting us into the light, the sunshine, the sunlit path becomes clouded. Our thoughts become clouded. Our mind becomes clouded. So lay a dire custom's claim upon his heart. Aroused from sleep, they can be bound no more, afflicting the daylight and alarming night. So even at night, they begin to attack, invading at will his outer tenement. The stark glooms, grisly, dire inhabitants, mounting into God's light, all light perturb. So these stark, gloom, grisly, dire inhabitants mount into the light of our consciousness and disturb it and perturb it. Mounting into God's light, all light perturb. All they have touched or seen, they make their own. In nature's basement lodge, mind's passages fill. So you see how they attack. So they disrupt the thought's links and they lodge in our nature's basement and they fill the passages of our mind. Normally it is through the mind and the thoughts that they attack. You get thoughts of things that are dire, that are depressive or disturbing or destructive or dark. So we all can recognize those in ourselves. Invading at will his outer tenement, the stark glooms, grisly, dire inhabitants, mounting into God's light, all light perturb. All they have touched or seen they make their own. In nature's basement lodge, mind's passages fill, disrupt thought's links and musing sequences, break through the soul's stillness with a noise and cry, or they call the inhabitants of the abyss. Invite the instincts to forbidden joys, a laughter wake of dread demoniac mirth, and with nether riot and revel shake life's floor. Impotent to quell his terrible prisoners, appalled the householder helpless sits above. So the householder here is the occupant of the body. So once they start attacking, impotent to quell their terrible attack, appalled the householder helpless sits above, taken from him his house is his no more. So they can totally possess. If it continues on, possession can take place, and the psychic being sits above, completely appalled, can't act. It goes completely submerged, and the outer being and the darkness of the outer nature, the disturbances overtake the being. So disturbances can be violent, they can be demoniac, they can be dark, they can be disturbing. In each, they can be in various forms depending on the nature of the person. So, impotent to quell his terrible prisoners, appalled the householder helpless sits above, taken from him his house is his no more. He is bound and forced, a victim of the play, or allured, joys in the mad and mighty din. So, either he becomes the victim, and is unable to do anything of this terrible play of the asuric energies that play in him, or he becomes a willing, collaborates with the dark forces. His natures, or lured, joys in the mad and mighty din. He becomes part of it. His nature's dangerous forces have arisen and hold at will a rebel's holiday, aroused from the darkness where they crouched in the depths. Aroused from the darkness where they crouched in the depths, prisoned from the sight, they can be held no more. Just look at the beautiful poetry and the way the sentence has been constructed here. It is absolutely unbelievable how he's describing these psychological conditions that exist in man, in us, in the most beautiful way. Aroused from the darkness where they crouched in the depths, the poetry of it. Aroused from the darkness where they crouched in the depths, prisoned from the sight, they can be held no more. His nature's impulses are now his lords. Once quelled or wearing specious names and vests, infernal elements, demon powers are there. Man's lower nature hides these awful guests. So these wonderful, awful guests hide in our lower nature. Man's lower nature hides these awful guests. Their vast contagion. So they are also contagious. So as the light is contagious, so is the darkness. That is why we have to keep in the company of people who always take us towards the light. Refuse to be influenced by those who are pessimistic, who are destructive, who are always finding fault, who are always bringing the dark side of everything forward. Keep away from them, because it is a big contagion. Like you get a contagion of the light when you're with somebody who is full of light, full of joy, full of the highest parts of your own, of existence. Those are the kind of people you should try and keep the company of. Why? Because your mind and your outer nature is still very, very impure, all of us. We have to be very careful with the company we keep, the kind of people we meet, the kind of books we read, the kind of films we see, the kind of conversations we engage in, and the conversations we listen to, other people engage in. So we don't get contaminated, because there is a tremendous contagion of these forces. So this is something that is very, very useful even for us when we are in our daily work coming across people who are negative. Be aware of negative people. Do not come near them. So, his nature's impulses are now his lords. Once quelled or wearing specious names and vests, infernal elements, demon powers are there. Man's lower nature hides these awful guests. Their vast contagion grips sometimes man's world. So these guests that housed in our lower nature, sometimes they come up and they grip your life, grip your world. And then you're caught in this terrible negativity, darkness, pessimism, depression. So it can take so many forms. It depends on your nature. But the main thing is to avoid this kind of thought process so that they don't grip you. And sometimes we are not even aware that we are caught in it. That is the worst part of it. We are unconscious of the influences. We are unconscious. We think our mind gives a good explanation why something is justified. But anything that takes you away from the light and from the inner bliss and joy is not justified. So get rid of that idea. Get rid of those thoughts. Get rid of those people from your life. His nature's impulses are now his lords, once quelled or wearing specious names and vests. Infernal elements, demon powers are there. Man's lower nature hides these awful guests. Their vast contagion grips sometimes man's world. An awful insurgence overpowers man's soul. In house and house, the huge uprising grows. So it's contagious. In house and house, the huge uprising grows. Hell's companies are loosed to do their work. Into the earth ways they break out from all doors, invade with bloodlust and the will to slay, and fill with horror and carnage God's fair world. So this is what often happens in periods of collective contagion, war, and fear. You see how the coronavirus has also worked in the same way. It's through fear this time. From house to house, from person to person. Terrible fear. In our subconscious, it is the action of these same forces that are working. And these forces are so insidious, they will enter into you. Whole earth is submerged by it. There's not one country, one person who's, well, there are some people who are not involved in it, but those people are very conscious. But most people have got involved in this whole game. And they are all now, no other diseases exist in the world. All diseases have been eradicated. If anyone dies, they only die of coronavirus. If any politician dies, he has to have died of corona. Heart attacks have stopped. Cancer is to the minimum. You see all hospitals, only dead bodies of coronavirus going on. What is happening here? What is the deep psychological fear that has got attached to human nature and humankind in a collective way? This is another kind of war that has happened here. This is not a physical war like World War I and World War II, where the same contagion got hold of armies and people and their egos and the way they went from one destruction to the other. People who have never harmed an insect or animal in their lives were killing people, thousands and thousands and thousands of them. So this is the same contagion, but this time the contagion in the world has gone through fear. Fear is the carrier. Anybody who's fearful is going to catch it. So the most important thing is to understand that these forces exist on a collective level, on a world level, on a personal level, in a family level, on a relationship level. They will come, they will attack. Be conscious of these dark forces. Be conscious of those who are carrying them. Stay away from them. Don't get caught in their vibrations. Now, you hear people talking about illnesses all the time, yeah? This happened to me, and everybody loves listening to stories on the phone. They'll talk to their family. Mera ye hua, fir I went for the doctor, then the doctor said this, then I got this surgery done, and then that happened. Don't want to listen, just cut off the connection, say I've got somewhere else to go. Don't get involved in these conversations, because this is how it enters you. There are other people you meet. Whenever you meet them, they're complaining about somebody else. Those are the kind of people you say, buddy, you complain about someone else, do it to the tree, not to me. I am not getting caught in your vibration. So this is the way. You have to be clear, straightforward, and say, get lost. I want nothing to do with you. Stay in the atmosphere of the light. Stay in the atmosphere of the divine. You'll have a completely different experience and outlook. Don't get caught in negativity. You understand? And negative people. There are quite a few. They are all little batteries operating. You decide which battery you want to go to. The battery of light or battery of darkness. So, death and his hunters stalk a victim earth. The terrible angel smites at every door. An awful laughter mocks at the world's pain. So when this world is going through the terrible pain, the Titan and the Asura is laughing. An awful laughter mocks at the world's pain. and massacre and torture grin, smile at heaven. All is the prey of the destroying force. All is the prey of the destroying force. Creation rocks and tremble top and base. So, Clear the Mother is often said, we have an envelope around us, what is called the physical vital envelope, or the etheric body, or the protective subtle physical body, the Sukshma Shariram. If you allow that to get broken with fear, anything, you will catch that illness. If you have no fear, you will never catch it. In the same way, any virus, whether it's corona or phorona or flu or whatever name you want to call it, can only act through one medium, fear. It cannot act without fear. There's no power. If your envelope is strong and you have no fear, nothing can touch you. Nothing can touch you. So remember that in your life. Be conscious when fear enters you. Get rid of it. Any kind of fear. Mental fear, vital fear, physical fear. So, an awful laughter mocks at the world's pain, and massacre and torture grin at heaven. All is the prey of the destroying force. Creation rocks and tremble top and base. This evil nature housed in human hearts, a foreign inhabitant, a dangerous guest. So this evil nature housed in human hearts, a foreign inhabitant, a dangerous guest. The soul that harbors it, it can dislodge. So the soul that harbors this guest, it can completely dislodge that soul. Expel the householder, possess the house. So it will expel the householder. Here is the soul, the psychic being, psychic spark. It will expel the psychic and possess the house. This is, of course, possessions that take place. You see that certain people are possessed. You see even in the ashram that many people who had turned to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo and to the yoga, after a while, could not get rid of the dark forces came up, corrupted their mind. They went into very, very dark ways, started attacking the ashram, put cases against the ashram, started believing that everything that was happening was dark, only saw the empty glass, refused to see every glass is half empty or half full. You decide which way you want to look. Do you want to look at life with what it does not have, or do you want to look at life and people with what there is? Always look at the potential of each person, and always look at the glass half full, not half empty. And the same goes in the ashram. When those people started criticizing in their minds other people, the Mother, Sri Aurobindo, the ashram, what was going on, they got under the influence of the dark forces, the asuric forces. And after a while, they had to be asked to leave the ashram. So this is something very important. You have to remember this. Wherever you go, be conscious of the thoughts. Be positive. And if you find negative thoughts, get rid of it. That is the worst disease you have. It's the negativity that is the worst disease. The critical negativity against people, against life, against situations is the worst disease we carry in ourselves. Get rid of it. A foreign inhabitant, a dangerous guest. The soul that harbors it, it can dislodge. Expel the householder, possess the house. An opposite potency, contradicting God, a momentary evil's almightiness, has straddled the straight path of nature's acts. It imitates the Godhead, it denies. So it imitates the Godhead, it denies. Puts on his figure and assumes his face. Now that is the problem of this, the way this particular force acts. This self-righteousness that I am protecting the right thing. I am protecting the ashram from going down. I am protecting the Gnostic center or whatever it might be from the demons that will otherwise ruin it or whatever it might be. This kind of thought process is itself very, very asuric. That is what it's trying to say. Expel the householder, possess the house. An opposite potency contradicting God, a momentary evil's almightiness, has straddled the straight path of nature's acts. It imitates the Godhead, it denies, puts on his figure and assumes his face. A Manichaean creator and destroyer, this can abolish man, annul his world. But there is a guardian power. There are hands that save. Calm eyes divine regard the human scene. So in the end, of course, of this quite scary passage, Sri Aurobindo ends with the wonderful lines that there is a guardian power, there are hands that save. There is a guardian power, there are hands that save. Calm eyes divine regard the human scene. So this guardian power And these hands that save are always outstretched towards us. All we need to do is to reject the darkness, reject the negativity, and suddenly in 1 minute from the darkness, one enters into the light. It's just like a hand, like that mother says. Between your two hands, you can decide to be in this state of darkness or this state of light. It's so simple because this guardian power is there. Even if there is a possession, even if there is negativity, you can come out of it just by that simple aspiration to this guardian power. So there is a guardian power, there are hands that save, and therefore the earth, even though we are besieged by the worst, fear psychosis that we have gone through, I have seen, at least in my lifetime, I'm sure we will come out of it. Okay. But there is a guardian power. There are hands that save. Calm eyes divine regard the human scene. All the world's possibilities in man are waiting as the tree waits in its seed. His past lives in him. It drives his future's pace. His presence acts fashion his coming fate. The unborn gods hide in his house of life. The demons of the unknown overshadow his mind, casting their dreams into live molds of thought, the molds in which his mind builds out its world. His mind creates around him its universe. All that has been renews in him its birth. So the universe is created by the mind, your mind. Each of us creates the universe around ourselves by our mind. So the molds in which his mind builds out its world, his mind creates around him its universe. All that has been renews in him its birth. All that can be is figured in his soul, issuing in deeds its course on the roads of the world, obscure to the interpreting reason's guess, lines of the secret purpose of the gods. In strange directions runs the intricate plan. Held back from human foresight is their end, and the far intention of some ordering will, or the order of life's arbitrary chance, finds out its settled poise and fated hour. Our surface, watched in vain by reason's gaze, invaded by the impromptus of the unseen, helpless records the accidents of time, the involuntary turns and leaps of life. Only a little of us foresees its steps. Only a little has will and purposed pace. A vast subliminal is man's measureless part. The dim subconscient is his cavern base. Abolished vainly in the walks of time, our past lives still in our unconscious selves, and by the weight of its hidden influences is shaped our future's self-discovery. Thus, all is an inevitable chain, and yet a series seems of accidents. The unremembering hours repeat the old acts. Our dead past round our future's ankles cling and drags back the new nature's glorious stride. Or from its buried corpse, old ghosts arise, old thoughts, old longings, dead passions live again, recur in sleep or move the waking man, to words that force the barrier of the lips, to deeds that suddenly start and overleap his head of reason and his guardian will. An old self lurks in the new self we are. Hardly we escape from what we once had been. In the dim gleam of habits, passages, in the subconscious's darkling corridors, all things are carried by the porter nerves, and nothing checked by the subterranean mind, unstudied by the guardians of the doors, and passed by a blind instinctive memory. The old gang dismissed, old cancelled passports serve. Nothing is wholly dead that once had lived. In dim tunnels of the world's being and in ours, the old rejected nature still survives. The corpses of its slain thoughts raise their heads and visit mind's nocturnal walks in sleep. Its stifled impulses breathe and move and rise. All keeps a phantom immortality. Irresistible are nature's sequences. The seeds of sins renounced sprout from hid soil. The evil cast from our hearts once more we face. Our dead selves come to slay our living soul. A portion of us lives in present time. A secret mass in dim inconscience gropes. Out of the inconscient and subliminal arisen, we live in mind's uncertain light and strive to know and master a dubious world whose purpose and meaning are hidden from our sight. Above us dwells a superconscient God, hidden in the mystery of his own light. Around us is a vast of ignorance, lit by the uncertain ray of human mind. Below us sleeps the inconscient, dark and mute. But this is only matter's first self-view, a scale and series in the ignorance. This is not all we are, or all our world. Our greater self of knowledge waits for us. A supreme light in the truth-conscious vast. It sees from summits beyond thinking mind. It moves in a splendid air transcending life. It shall descend and make earth's life divine. So after this very potent and accurate description of human nature and the mind and the man's life, Sri Aurobindo, the narrator, then says, our greater self of knowledge yet waits for us, the supreme light in the truth-conscious vast. And when that greater self of knowledge descends, that will make earth's life divine. Truth made the world, not a blind nature force. For here are not our large diviner heights, our summits in the superconscious blaze, are glorious with the very face of God. There is our aspect of eternity. There is the figure of the God we are. His young, unaging look on deathless things. His joy in our escape from death and time. His immortality and light and bliss. So this aspect of eternity, this figure of the God we are, is where? Is in the summits in the superconscious blaze. And this superconscious blaze, this glorious very face of God, this aspect of our eternal self, has young, unaging look on deathless things and takes joy in our escape from death and time. His immortality and light and bliss, our larger being sits behind cryptic walls. So this our larger being sits behind cryptic walls. There our greatness is hidden in our unseen parts. So there are greatnesses hidden in our unseen parts that wait there are to step into life's front. We feel an aid from deep indwelling gods. So not only are there greatnesses hidden in our unseen parts, we also feel that there is some help, there is some guidance from deep indwelling gods, from the psychic entity. So above is the superconscious blaze, within is the aid and guide of the psychic being, psychic entity. So we feel an aid from deep indwelling gods. One speaks within, light comes to us from above. So both, one speaks within is the guide that speaks within, and the light that comes from above. So this is a wonderful correspondence with what we have read in the Triple Transformation. You remember, in the Triple Transformation, we read about the psychic transformation and the spiritual transformation. So here, that is what Sri Aurobindo is speaking about. And that is why, you see, the name of the chapter is called The Parable of the Search for the Soul. Parable, because it is like Savitri's story, that's a parable. But it actually is much wider and universal. It's like, what are parables? Stories. So Savitri is a representative of her search for the soul, is actually the story of the search for the soul of man, of human beings. Our larger being sits behind cryptic walls. There are greatnesses hidden in our unseen parts that wait their hour to step into life's front. We feel an aid from deep indwelling gods. One speaks within, light comes to us from above. Our soul from its mysterious chamber acts. Its influence pressing on our heart and mind pushes them to exceed their mortal selves. It seeks for good and beauty and for God. What seeks for good and beauty and for God? The soul within, the guide within, the psychic entity, the psychic, what he calls our soul from its mysterious chamber acts. It's the psychic pressure of the psychic being, the psychic soul, that acts from the inner chamber of our heart. Its influence pressing on our heart and mind pushes them to exceed their mortal selves. It seeks for good and beauty and for God. We see beyond self's walls our limitless self. So, we see beyond self's walls our limitless self. Self's walls, the self of the ego, the self of the ordinary outer nature and person. We see beyond self's walls our limitless self. We gaze through our world's glass at half-seen vasts. We hunt for the truth behind apparent things. Our inner mind dwells in a larger light. How wonderful. Our inner mind dwells in a larger light. Its brightness looks at us through hidden doors. Our members luminous grow, and wisdom's face appears in the doorway of the mystic ward. So this inner mind dwells in a larger light. Remember, we spoke about the inner mind, the inner vital, and the inner physical in the triple transformation. So here, the inner mind, now you know what is happening. This wonderful description of the discovery of the soul that Savitri is going through. Our inner mind dwells in a larger light. Its brightness looks at us through hidden doors. Our members luminous grow, and wisdom's face appears in the doorway of the mystic ward. When she enters into our house of outward sense, then we look up and see above her sun. So when she enters into our house of outward sense, right? Then we look up and see above her sun. A mighty life self with its inner powers supports the dwarfish modicum we call life. It can graft upon our crawl two puissant wings. Our body's subtle self is throned within in its viewless palace of veridical dreams. So, our body's subtle self is that luminous body, the subtle body, is thrown within in its viewless palace of veridical dreams. That are bright shadows of the thoughts of God. In the prone, obscure beginnings of the race. Sure.
What are the two puissant wings?
It can graft upon our crawl two puissant wings. So, what do you think are the two puissant wings?
He's speaking of the inner vital here, right?
He's speaking about the inner vital and the inner body also, subtle body.
Next lines.
Yeah. So appears in the doorway of the mystic ward. Our members luminous grow, and wisdom's face appears in the doorway of the mystic ward. When she enters into our house of, the wisdom's face, that is when she enters, this wisdom's face is actually the face of the presence, the divine presence. When she enters into our house, into the doorway of the mystic ward, when she enters into a house of her son, a mighty life self with its inner powers. So then he goes on, her son, then he continues, a mighty life self, the true, again above. Now, the inner has influenced the divine presence to come forward. It's come into the outer senses. The outer senses have been transmuted, have become open to the light, and have become, in a way, transformed, and can see the true sight, not the outer sight, not the outer smell, not the outer hearing, but are open to the subtle hearing, the subtle sight, and the subtle vision. And when these open in our senses, in our outer senses, in the outer nature, then you can, when you look up, you see the sun, that is, you see the true mind or the higher mind, you see the higher vital, the higher life, you see the truth from which all our parts have come from, the highest parts. So that is what is being described here. Okay? A mighty life self with its inner powers supports the dwarfish modicum we call life. Then we see that our life, that we call life, is actually supported by a mighty life self, the true life, the super life, the place from which all life comes down, whatever you want to call it. You can call it true vital, the true life source, whatever. I mean, he's not used those words here. It's poetic, but you can see the correlation. Now, then we look up and see above her son, a mighty life self. Life self. So remember, it's not mind self, it's life self. With its inner powers, supports the dwarfish modicum we call life. Okay? So this self of life supports this what we call life, the living things, prana. So what do you want to call it? Now, it can graft upon our crawl two puissant wings. Our body's subtle self is throned within. So this mighty life self can graft, can create in our life two puissant means our whole, it can bring about a kind of, you can begin to, your subtle self, your subtle body, it can create a new life within the outer ordinary life. That means you can begin to live in a higher, deeper way, and you can become aware of your luminous body. And the true body which is above can begin to influence, or the true life that is above, you can begin to influence the vital life which is below and transform it. So, it's the vital transformation that she's speaking of here. Correct, yeah. So from this, if you want to look at it from the point of Sri Aurobindo's yoga, if you read letters on yoga, you will see there is a chapter called Transformation of the Vital. This is what it's referring to here. So, in the prone, obscure beginnings of the race, the human grew in the bowed ape-like man. Now, after that are bright, now he stops, full stop. Now he's starting to go back to the beginning of life. He says, when life first started, when the life and mind came into the human being, the human grew in the prone, obscure beginnings of the race. When the first beginnings of the human race began, long, long millenniums ago, then what happened? So he's explaining that. In the prone, obscure beginnings of the race. Which race? Not rat race. Human race. Okay? In the prone, obscure beginnings of the race, the human grew in the bowed ape-like man. So this is a description of how the human evolution took place from the ape. So here you have a confirmation that Sri Aurobindo agreed with Darwin's theory to some degree of human evolution, that evolution in the physical grew from the ape to the man. Okay? Interesting that he's brought this in here. In the prone, obscure beginnings of the race, the human grew in the bowed ape-like man. He stood erect, a godlike form and force. So he stood erect in the ape-like man. You saw the apes in history, in our mythology. And through the ape-like man, the human grows. The human grew in the bowed ape-like man. He stood erect, a godlike form and force. And a soul's thoughts looked out from earth-born eyes. Man stood erect. He wore the thinker's brow. So the ape was not the man. In the ape grew the man, the human being. And distinction between the ape, which remained in evolution, even today you can see the apes, and man is that he stood erect within and had a soul view that looked out. So just see how beautifully he describes the evolution of the first human being and race through the animal evolution of the ape.
Often it comes back to me, and now when we are reading, you directed this play in Miranda.
Called?
It was on evolution where my group did it, Bhaskar and all that group, where it was that prone, it was precisely this. First it began with everybody prone and the sky is pressing down on them, and gradually they rise up and they push the sky up and they stand straight.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally it was also a flight, silver magpie.
Ah.
You had
Written it?
you had written it and directed it. It often comes back to me, and now when you were reading again that.
Must be some sort of intuition at that point. Too young to have understood all this. Okay, so this is the past, my past coming through. You see? This is the past that lives and comes through. Okay, the human grew in the bowed ape-like man. He stood erect, a godlike form and force, and a soul's thoughts looked out from earth-born eyes. Man stood erect. He wore the thinker's brow. He looked at heaven and saw his comrade stars. A vision came of beauty and greater birth, slowly emerging from the heart's chapel of light, and moved in a white, lucent air of dreams. He saw his being's unrealized vastnesses. He aspired and housed the nascent demigod out of the dim recesses of the self. The occult seeker into the open came. He heard the far and touched the intangible. He gazed into the future and the unseen. He used the powers earth instrument. Maybe he's saying, I'm guessing again, that when first human beings arose and the first human race arose, there was still that purity there. And over time, as we began to evolve, and I think, let's see, that's the feeling I'm getting. I don't think he's realized this psychic being here. He's just talking about the evolutionary man, which has just come, like the first human race, and the man, how he comes out from the ape, and then he comes, and the mind comes in, and then he thinks, and he can see, and so on. So he looked at heaven and saw his comrade stars, and so he stood erect, a godlike form and force. From the ape, you can imagine it, man must have first looked, when the first man came, quite godlike, because the ape was ugly and with full hair and looking like down man, and how he was so attached to, and the first man. So this is what the description is, I think. Who? He was the epitome, the last before, between. He was a god. He was the prototype kind of thing. While the ape was the lower form of his race. So he saw his being's unrealized vastnesses. He aspired and housed the nascent demigod. So don't forget, here he's aspired and housed a nascent. Nascent is, what is the meaning of the word nascent? Unborn. Nascent means small, like just beginning to emerge. Nascent demigod. Note the word demi. He saw his being's unrealized vastnesses. He aspired. So aspiration comes only with the human form and the human beings. Apes cannot aspire. Understand?
Not mentally, but like Mother says.
Now I'm talking about that time, when that.
No, like the plants also aspire for life. That's why they turn towards the.
Yeah, but this aspiration is a different one. That is an instinctive aspiration, that go towards light. He aspired and housed the nascent demigod out of the dim recesses of the self. And the self is a small s. Out of the dim recesses of the self, that is, the occult seeker into the open came. He heard the far and touched the intangible. He gazed into the future and the unseen. He used the powers earth instruments cannot use. A pastime made of the impossible. He caught up fragments of the omniscient's thought. He scattered formulas of omnipotence. Thus man, in his little house, made of earth's dust, grew towards an unseen heaven of thought and dream, looking into the vast vistas of his mind on a small globe dotting infinity. So it's quite clear. It's the human mind. On a small globe dotting infinity. At last, climbing a long and narrow stair, he stood alone on the high roof of things and saw the light of a spiritual sun. So, at last, climbing a long and narrow stair of the mind, he stood alone on the high roof of things and saw the light of a spiritual sun. Aspiring, he transcends his earthly self. Now, this is the special quality of man, that he can, through aspiration, transcend his earthly self, his present earthly nature. No other being, nothing on earth can do that, except the human being and the human form and the human race. So here we see, aspiring, he transcends his earthly self. He stands in the largeness of his soul, newborn, redeemed from encirclement by mortal things, and moves in a pure, free spiritual realm, as in the rare breath of a stratosphere, a last end of far lines of divinity. He mounts by a frail thread to his high source. He reaches his fount of immortality. He calls the Godhead into his mortal life. All this the Spirit concealed had done in her. So her is Savitri. That through this whole narrative, he brings back the narrative back to Savitri and says, all of this, the Spirit concealed in Savitri, has done for her. All this has taken place in Savitri. So, a last end of far lines of divinity, he mounts by a frail thread to his high source. He reaches his fount of immortality. He calls the Godhead into his mortal life. All this the Spirit concealed had done in her. That's why the parable of the search for the soul. All this the Spirit concealed had done in her. A portion of the mighty Mother came. A portion of the mighty Mother came into Savitri, into her, as into its own human part. So here we see the transformation. The mighty Mother enters into Savitri as into its own human part. A portion of the mighty Mother came into her as into its own human part. Amid the cosmic workings of the gods, it marked her, the center of a wide-drawn scheme, dreamed in the passion of her far-seeing spirit to mold humanity into God's own shape. So, dreamed in the passion of her far-seeing spirit, because of her intense aspiration, Savitri became the figure, the symbol, and the parable of the descent of the Divine Mother into the human being. A portion of the mighty Mother came into her as into its own part. Amid the cosmic workings of the gods, it marked her the center of a wide-drawn scheme, dreamed in the passion of her far-seeing spirit to mold humanity into God's own shape and lead this great, blind, struggling world to light. So Savitri also became the harbinger, the evolutionary head of leading humanity into this light, this light of immortality. So, dreamed in the passion of her far-seeing spirit to mold humanity into God's own shape. You understand? So she was the precursor to mold humanity into God's own shape and lead this great, blind, struggling world to light, or a new world discover or create. Earth must transform herself and equal heaven, or heaven descend into earth's mortal state. But for such vast spiritual change to be, out of the mystic cavern in man's heart, the heavenly psyche must put off her veil. But for this change to take place, this vast spiritual change, it is imperative, it is indispensable that out of the mystic cavern in man's heart, in the heart of the human race, what should happen? The heavenly psyche, the psychic entity, must put off her veil and come forward into this as a psychic being and be the leader of the progress and the evolution of the human race. So the psychic has to come forward as a psychic being not only in the collective human race, like mind is today the leader of the human race. In the same way, when the psychic comes forward as the leader of the human race, then there will be the change from the earth to to the life divine. Earth as it is today, which is not, is full of the inconscious and subconscious and subliminal and so on. The dark forces and the light forces, everything is mixed up. That will change. Life will change. Human nature will change. Humanity will change. The human race will change into a new race. But for that to happen, the heavenly psyche, the psychic being, the psychic entity, has to come forward and lead human evolution, lead the human race. Here he's talking about the collective. So, but for such vast spiritual change to be, so listen to this, I'll read the last lines again. Earth must transform herself and equal heaven, or heaven descend into earth's mortal state. But for such vast spiritual change to be, for heaven to descend into earth's mortal state, or for earth to transform herself and equal heaven, what has to happen? But for such vast spiritual change to be, out of the mystic cavern in man's heart, the heavenly psyche must put off her veil. She's veiled, she's hidden, she's behind, and step into common nature's crowded rooms. So this psyche, when it steps into the common nature's crowded rooms, so the crowded rooms could be the vital, the mental, and the physical. The physical mind, the vital mind, the mental mind, the physical nature, the vital nature, the mental nature. All these are crowded rooms. Outer nature of man, outer nature of humanity, the outer nature of life on earth today is like crowded rooms. You see what's going on. So, and step into common nature's crowded rooms and stand uncovered in that nature's front. And who will stand uncovered in that nature's front? The psychic. And stand uncovered in that nature's front and rule its thoughts and fill the body and life. So here you are, all the three parts. Rule its thoughts, fill the body and life. The vital, the physical, and the mental. Mental, vital, physical. So, obedient to a high command, she sat. Time, life, and death were passing incidents. So, obedient to a high command, she sat. Who sat? Obedient to a high command, she sat. Time, life, and death were passing incidents, obstructing with their transient view her sight. Whose sight? Savitri's sight. So she saw time, life, all of time, all of life, and all of death right in front. They were obstructing her with their transient view her sight. But she could see they were all in front. Her sight that must break through and liberate the God. Okay? And liberate the God imprisoned in the visionless mortal man. So which God should her sight break through? The God that is imprisoned in the visionless mortal man. Okay?
Because hers is already liberated.
Hers is liberated. She's the precursor. She's the, yeah. So now, her sight that must break through and liberate the God imprisoned in the visionless mortal man, the inferior nature born into ignorance, still took too large a place. So the inferior nature born into ignorance still took too large a place. It veiled herself and must be pushed aside to find her soul. So this inferior nature, this visionless imprisonment that does not allow mortal man, humanity, to see through, still in this end of this canto, still the narrator remarks, still has a very large place in the world, in humanity, in life, and therefore unless it is pushed aside, one cannot find one's soul. So, the inferior nature born into ignorance still took too large in our countries is the next thing where Savitri, psychic being has come forward, but the psychic being has still not been able to completely immortalize her and to completely change her outer nature because it's still very deeply ingrained in human ignorance. So because she's got the human parts in her still. That's what he's saying, yeah. And rule its thoughts and fill the body life. Obedient to a high command she sat. Time, life and death were passing incidents. So that much she's already seen and that these are all passing incidents. She's in touch with her soul. Her psychic being has come forward, obstructing with their transient. So even when the psychic being comes forward, the transformation of human nature still takes time. It can't be, the psychic being has come forward, your whole nature is transformed. It doesn't happen like that. It's not magic. So, Obedient to a high command she sat. Time, life, and death were passing incidents, obstructing with their transient view her sight that must break through and liberate the God imprisoned in the visionless mortal man. The inferior nature born into ignorance still took too large a place. It veiled herself and must be pushed aside to find her soul. Savitri. End of Canto 2. Therefore, so this pushing aside of her inferior nature and finding her soul, when we come to Canto 5, the finding of the soul. And then she will be able to destroy death and take on death and actually follow Satyavan.
The spiritual journey starts from the realization of psychic.
So the triple transformation, psychic is the first. Without the psychic transformation, the spiritual transformation does not begin, especially in Sri Aurobindo's yoga, where his yoga is life transforming. If it was not life transforming and one had to just go into one's personal nirvanic or liberation, then you don't need to go to psychic. You can go straight to the spiritual. But then you cannot transform this world and life or your human nature. Okay.